stop, Exeter.
Hello, I'm Paul Nicholson, your host for Next Stop Exeter. Welcome to March. It's a lot like February so far. We ran a story in February where we met with several colonial soldiers at the Winter Street Cemetery. We've gotten feedback from viewers wanting to know more about our colonial soldiers. So you can look forward to a brief story on the colonial soldiers.
Okay, go.
Okay, hi, I'm with Greg Morton, who's from Epping, and he's here participating in this great event today. And I noticed when I saw you with this musket. This is a little bit smaller than the one I used to have. Tell me a bit about this musket.
Well, this is the first model Brown Bess musket. It's a 1766 model. It's basically this slightly modified. It served the British Army for over 100 years.
Yep.
It's a flintlock.
The Mexicans, right after.
It actually was served. It did serve in the Mexican War.
In
with the Mexican.
1846, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's not the gun that Daniel Morgan would have used from West Virginia, right?
You would have had a rifle.
You had a rifle. Gotcha.
The loading process with this is relatively simple. We carry the paper cartridges in this cartridge box. And you pull one. It would have a ball at one end and powder in the other. You rip off the cartridge, pour a little bit into the pan, close the pan. Cast about, dump the rest of the powder in, and the entire cartridge and ball into the top.
And how have you timed yourself on how long it takes for you to do that?
You're expected to fire 3 rounds a minute.
So in 20 seconds, you should be able to pull one of those out,
Absolutely. Load and fire.
tear the paper, pour the powder, load it, use the ramrod,
Absolutely.
and fire.
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. So I understand you guys had a big event last night in Durham.
Yes, we did. We did the UNH football game. We fire the cannon every home touchdown. And they won.
Yes.
Again.
Yes.
They're doing very good this year.
Do you know?
Long because of the cannons.
That's it.
Well, do you know they used to have a cannon there 30 years ago, and they had to stop using it because somebody got hurt.
Really?
Yes, correct. That's a true story. Yes. Yeah.
I'll have to look that up.
So what's the next big event on your guys' calendar?
Well, actually, we're probably going to go to the Candlelight Stroll tonight at Strawberry Bank.
It's Strawberry Bank. What time's that at?
I believe it's 4 to 7.
I think it's 5 to 9.
5 to 9. All right.
Yep. And how many other gentlemen are part of your contingent? I say gentlemen, there's probably some women involved in your contingent
absolutely.
too, right?
Absolutely. There are probably just as many women as men, really.
Family group.
Yeah. We have probably about 10 or 12 active male members.
Yep.
Female members, 8 maybe. And at one point, our militia was 40 people at least.
Going back to the bicentennial, there was probably about 50 or 60.
So did you guys get invited to any War of 1812
No.
200th anniversary parties?
Well, there's some of us do many different eras.
Gotcha.
I personally don't. We just do the Indian War.
Gotcha.
But no, we haven't done that. We've done the Raymond 250th this summer. We did the Fremont 250th. That was a really large event.
And were you invited to participate in any Patriots games?
No,
We haven't.
we know the people that do that.
Yep.
But
Any chance you guys are like on the practice squad where somebody gets sick and then you guys get to go to the game?
no, I mean,
No, it's a different. That's first and a half to
I believe it is.
It is. And do you guys really go all out and like go down the day before and camp out in the parking lot in tents, or no? No, you don't tie up horses at Patriot Place and then walk in the stadium.
No.
Gotcha.
It's we do tend. It's much easier to set up for 2 days. Like the Exeter Revolutionary Festival they had.
Yep.
Is a one-day event now. When it was a 2-day event, it was because you can come on Friday night.
Yep.
Set up all your stuff. Yeah. I mean, you have to bring, when encampment, you have to bring a lot of equipment. and to bring it for one day, it's an awful lot of work.
Have either of you been to Charlestown to Fort
Fort.
Absolutely.
Right.
I was on the Fort Ford militia.
Is that like the crack house at Forts?
It's beautiful.
It is?
Really is.
It is?
It really is.
It's a nice event.
It is a nice event.
The
There's
last time I went over there was for the French Union a year ago.
Yep.
And they had a lot of storms up in Canada, so enough French didn't come down to really make the battle even. So to speak.
Gotcha.
So we did a little nose counting, and I volunteered for the French.
Gotcha.
And usually it's a preordained winner,
Yep.
but not this time. It's going to win by field tactics. We won.
Gotcha.
It's a French win.
Really?
Really odd.
Were there any American Indian participants?
Oh yeah.
There were? Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, great, guys. Thanks very much
Well,
for
thank you,
doing this.
sir.
You'll get it filmed, and we'll see if we can get it on TV next month on our show.
well, thank you, sir.
And we recently ran a story on the Reverend George Whitefield. Barbara Rimkunis from the Exeter Historical Society provided us with a vast amount of information regarding the Reverend. But if it was possible, we may have undersold the Reverend. Shortly after we ran our story, a story ran in the Wall Street Journal regarding a recently published book about the life of Reverend George Whitefield. And I quote from this story two very, very important facts. The first is, yet at the height of his popularity in the 1740s, George Whitefield, the Anglican preacher and greatest evangelist of the First Great Awakening, was probably the most famous person in the English-speaking world, with the exception of the king himself. The author of the book also says that he reckons that Whitefield, quote, saw and met more people in Britain, Ireland, and America than any other person of the era. So please stay with us as we learn more about the Reverend George Whitefield.
So who was George Whitefield? That's what everybody wants to know about that marker. Well, first of all, it's not any kind of grave marker. He's not buried there. There's no bodies underneath Front Street at that end anyway. George Whitefield was a minister who was born in 1714 in England. And he became an Anglican minister in the Church of England. He went to Oxford University, studied very well there. He had a different take on preaching, however, which was very different from what they were used to in both England and in America at that time. He was an itinerant preacher, meaning he didn't have a settled parish. In New England towns at that time, your minister was pretty much the center of your town. The minister served as the judge. He was very much tied to the parish. Everyone paid parish taxes to pay that person. And so this was a position in town of some great authority. Whitefield, on the other hand, becomes part of a larger religious movement of the time called the Great Awakening, which I guess can be best described as a period of revivalism. And Whitefield comes into town and preaches out in the open fields. And Whitefield was a remarkable preacher for his time. He was able to really captivate a crowd. He had a very theatrical way of preaching. There's an actor in Britain who described him by saying that he could bring men to tears just by the way he pronounced Mesopotamia. I don't think we have anybody like that in modern day who can speak in that way. I would love to travel back in time just to hear him once. So perhaps a speaker like Martin Luther King Jr. would be as engaging as Whitefield might have been. And he spoke to thousands and thousands of people. This is very hard for us to comprehend because today, when you'd give a walking tour of the downtown of Exeter, for instance, even if you have only 10 people with you, it's very hard for them to hear what you're saying. And Whitefield is reported to have spoken to crowds of upwards of 30,000 people. And if that seems crazy to you, it seemed crazy even back then. Benjamin Franklin goes to see him speak in Philadelphia, and he doesn't believe that Whitefield can be heard by 10,000 people. And yet, when he stood on the street and listened to Whitefield, and he scientifically calculated the space that he would have had, how many people fit in each space, and he said he could do 30,000 people. So his voice must have been very remarkable. Whitefield also brings about this period that's called the Great Awakening, where people began to have a more personalized relationship with God. So perhaps your settled minister was less important than your own personal relationship. This was very challenging to the downtown, to the New England churches, and in Exeter it brought about a big schism we had one parish church called the First Parish Church, or the Congregational Church at the time, and in 1744 it splits apart into two different churches. We had the first parish and the second parish. We're one of the few places that actually had a second parish church. And unlike many towns, in Exeter, the second parish church, this group of evangelicals who left to follow the type of preaching that they had encountered with George Whitefield, tended to be the upper crust here. It was people like John Phillips, who founded Phillips Exeter Academy, and other such notables in town, rather than it being the townsfolk, the people who worked farms and such. Instead of here, it tended to be the more elite. That was kind of unusual. Even Whitefield found that unusual. When Whitefield comes to America in the late 1730s and begins to preach up and down the East Coast, he starts a series of orphanages in the South. He preaches in New England a great deal, felt a real kinship with New Englanders. And in Exeter, there was some hope that John Philip himself would actually lead the new church, but instead they hire a man named the Reverend Daniel Rogers, and he becomes the minister at the Second Parish Church. He and Whitefield remained good friends their whole lives. Whitefield came to America. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean something like 14 times, which is remarkable. It was not an easy journey at the time. And in 1770, he preaches his last sermon on September 29th here in Exeter. He was headed to Newburyport, and he was enticed to come into town to preach, and he agrees to do this. The Second Parish Church at that time stood on Front Street, where the Dow House is located today. And the morning that he was due to preach, it turns out that there were too many people there, and so they weren't able to have him preach inside the church. So initially he decided he was going to speak on the church steps, except it was morning and the sun was shining right in his face. This is the story as we have gotten it. I don't have any real eyewitness accounts. So they move him across the street to the other side, the opposite side of Front Street, facing the Dow House, which is where the monument's located today. And he preaches on that side of the street. And when people saw him initially getting on this sort of ramshackle platform that they had built for him, they were a bit concerned. He didn't look well. He looked tired. His appearance could be disarming anyway. He was a small, stoutly man. He was cross-eyed, which today we would find a bit distracting, but back then people felt that it made him closer to God to be somewhat cross-eyed. And yet he had this powerful, booming voice. But he said no, he was willing to preach. He stood on this built-up platform and he talked for 2 hours to thousands of people in Exeter. It's hard for us to imagine this. But picture a time when there's less ambient noise around, there's nobody firing up their lawnmower or anything like that, there's no traffic going by, so things are quieter, and he was able to actually preach. After the sermon was done, he went to have lunch here in town with the Gilman family, who lived today, right across the street from St. Michael's Church. And even they said he still didn't look well. Maybe he should stay overnight, go to Newburyport in the morning. He said no, he felt that he wanted to go. He suffered from bad asthma, and he felt that a brisk horseback ride all the way to Newburyport could help him. And apparently that's not too unreasonable for people with asthma. He climbed on the horse and went to Newburyport, and in spite of the fact that he had ridden that whole time, it didn't help. And by the next morning, he had died and was buried in the church in Newburyport, as per his wishes, underneath the pulpit, apparently. And that's our story of George Whitefield. In 1888, when the town of Exeter was celebrating its half-millennial, 250 years as a town, it was decided that some sort of monument needed to be put up to mark this particularly interesting event. And they had a specific committee. The committee I have to look it up here because it's got a funny name. The Committee on Interesting Localities in Exeter. That's really what it was called. And they decided that putting up a monument to Whitefield was very important. It was paid for by subscription, which meant that individuals pledged a certain amount of money. It wasn't terribly expensive. The work was done by Exeter Monument Works, which was up by the railroad tracks. And it was erected and dedicated in the fall of 18 1988. So it's been there since that time. And it does sort of look like it moves a lot. I think every single winter it gets bounced around by frost heaves and plows and such, but it still stands today, and we still have visitors who come to town specifically to see the Whitefield Monument.
We've all been challenged with all the snow that we've received here in Exeter this year. Many of us have had a difficult time just getting out of our own driveways just to get to our mailboxes. And speaking of getting to our mailboxes, the postal workers are having a real challenge getting to our mailboxes. If you have photos showing excessive snow on your property or in interesting places about town, we'd certainly love to see them. Perhaps we could show them on our show. Just email them to us at nextstopexeter@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Next Stop Exeter. Please join us again in 2 weeks with some news stories about what's going on in Exeter, including a national event which took place that affected our local community. All that and more in 2 weeks on Next Stop Exeter.